Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you to this exciting webinar, part of a series of in conservation economy. And before we delve into the webinar, I'd like to request the Secretariat to share the agenda. We are looking forward to this dialogue, and we have a very exciting panel of experts from different fields, from the civil society, from government, and from banking institutions and financial institutions, regional financial institutions. This webinar that is being hosted by the Africa CSO Biodiversity Alliance in collaboration with the Africa Development Bank. But we also have a host of other people that are joining us, about 135 different institutions or organizations within Africa have registered to participate. So we would like to have as many of you as possible. Even if you're not on the panel, we would like to hear from each other. We would like to hear from everybody's views. We have some house rules. Because we will not be able to respond verbally to each and everybody's questions, we would kindly request you to put your questions in the Q&A session. Then you put your question there and also indicate which one of the panelists you would like to respond. The panelists will try and respond to as many questions as they can. But also we would like to hear from you. We would like to have our own chat in the chat room where we can discuss as many views as they come about as we listen to the different presentations. So we will have we will have the opening remarks from to share the screen, Jamvan and Olivia, to share the agenda. Okay. Thank you very much. So we have a very detailed agenda. We have an agenda that is bringing in very many perspectives from different people. We will open it up by some welcoming remarks from the host organizations, which is Africa Development Bank, presented by Vanessa Ushi, who is the Division Manager for Policy Analysis in the African Natural Resources Center of the Africa Development Bank. And then we also have Dr. Kadu Sebunya, the Chief Executive Officer of Africa Wildlife Foundation. Africa Wildlife Foundation is currently providing the Secretariat to the Africa CSO Biodiversity Alliance. Then to set context for the dialogue, we will have a keynote presentation from Sandy Shad, who is, and the context will be put using the Dasgupta report on the economics of biodiversity. Now, this report was commissioned by the UK government, and Sandy Shad was the head of the review team. So we will hear from her before we go into the dialogue. And then in the dialogue, we will have a panel of practitioners coming from the CSO perspective, as well as the regional banks. Then we shall provide some room for responding to some questions as they come about, and we will have closing remarks from Zeneb from the Africa Development Bank. Without much ado, I would like to invite Vanessa to give her welcoming remarks, followed by Dr. Sebunya. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the moderator, and thank you to our distinguished guests, speakers, partners, and all who have gathered here today. So I'll start off by saying all protocols observed. And I welcome you all to this very important policy dialogue. I'm very delighted to be here today to give the opening remarks at this webinar, which is focused on the economics of biodiversity and African grassroots perspective. On behalf of the African Natural Resources Center and the Chief Economist and Economic Governance and Knowledge Management Vice Presidency of the African Development Bank, I am honored to meet with so many men and women from civil society, indigenous communities, and youth groups working to protect and conserve Africa's natural capital. Your energy and dedication are truly inspiring. Let me thank our co-hosts, the Africa CSO Biodiversity Alliance and the African Wildlife Foundation, who have made this webinar possible in collaboration with the African Development Bank. I cannot imagine a more befitting audience than the grouping present today, which includes representatives of the UK Treasury, civil society, indigenous communities, and youth, as well as regional development finance institutions, to discuss conservation economics, guided by the findings of the landmark Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity. Ladies and gentlemen, following the release of the final reports of the Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity earlier this year, we have learned that the most biodiverse countries in the world are found in Africa. Indeed, natural wealth of African countries, and yet its value is often unaccounted for in economic modeling and decision-making. The Dasgupta review sets out some proposals for reshaping the global economy and calls for policymakers, business leaders, financial sectors, and communities to play their parts. It further advocates for adopting a polycentric approach that pools knowledge and perspectives at all levels. I am very pleased that across the African continent, there's a growing coalition of actors in government, private sector, civil society, and development finance institutions, taking major steps on the conservation of biodiversity and nature. The COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us too well of the intrinsic value of healthy ecosystems and the role of human action in preserving the vital ecosystem services that support our communities, economies, and societies. The African Development Bank is pleased to engage with all segments of civil society and other stakeholders to strengthen Africa's voice and priorities on biodiversity in support of the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment, AMSEN, and the Conference of African Heads of States and Governments on Climate Change and their common positions. The bank supports efforts of African countries for a green and resilient recovery focused on building back better through instruments such as its COVID-19 response facility by mainstreaming biodiversity and nature into these operations. The bank, for instance, is embarking on a new initiative to mainstream natural capital in African development finance in partnership with the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership and WWF, with funding from the Marber Foundation and the government of Germany. We are also scaling up investments in nature-based solutions that address biodiversity loss and contribute to climate change adaptation and mitigation. In the light of the debt crisis for Africa, the feasibility of using debt for nature swaps as a financing tool, which would be used by African countries facing debt distress, climate vulnerability, biodiversity loss, and limited access to credit. In sum, the AfDB is very eager to learn more from this dialogue, to hear from African voices, from the grassroots, regional economic communities, on the opportunities to achieve the vision of the Dasgupta development in Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, in the words of Professor Parker, true fruitful deliberations. Thank you. And back to the moderator.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Over to you, Dr. Sebunya.
Thank you very much, Pauline and Vanessa. Thanks for your opening remarks and for the partnership here. Greetings, everyone, and all protocol observed, as Vanessa did. It's indeed a pleasure to welcome you here at the webinar that focuses on two important subject areas in our respective fields, and that is economics and biodiversity. First off, let me begin by introducing you to the African Wildlife Foundation. For 60 years, the African Wildlife Foundation has been the leading, oldest international NGO focused solely on Africa, working to conserve the continent's unique wildlife assets. To achieve our mission, that is ensuring that wildlife is sustained in a modernizing Africa, we work within Africa at scale, but also at the global level with partners that include national governments, institutions, and individuals throughout the world. We believe that Africa's right now stands at a crossroad, that the decisions that countries take now will have enduring impacts on people, the opportunities they will be able to have to access, and the environment upon which they depend on. This is because Africa is changing on our watch. The World Bank projects that Africa's population is likely to grow more than double by 2050. And in the next, perhaps 100 years, half the population in the world below age 18 will be Africans. Therefore, Africa's population growth will need to be matched by economic growth. An increase in the demand for food, energy, and infrastructure necessary for economic development is inevitable. Addressing this resource demand will be, or is going to be, the game changer for Africa's ecosystems. But also we know Africa is being home to one third of the world's biodiversity. It intimates that biodiversity's critical contribution to both climate change, mitigation, and adaptation is important. There are about, for example, about 1,100 protected areas and conservation areas in Africa, covering over 3 million square kilometers. About 26% of the total land surface in East and Southern Africa, and 10% in West and Central Africa. These large landscapes provide habitat for wildlife, but also vital ecosystem services for our food security, fresh water, clean air, shelter, and soils for agriculture. There are 65% water sources for major African cities and contributes heavily to 80% of Africans involved in subsistence agriculture. That's the total service from our protected areas. If there is one thing that COVID-19 pandemic has taught us, it is that the world is flat. It's no longer them and us. It is what South Africans call Ubuntu, or in my language from Uganda, Ubuntu. And the world now famously call One Health. I am because you are. What this means is that whatever happens in Africa is definitely set to affect the Americas, Europe, and Asia significantly. This cements the fact that progress can only be achieved if we work together. The world desperately needs a relationship that acknowledges and harnesses African voices beyond government platforms to inform decision-making policies. We also recognize that deeper consideration among ourselves as Africans is necessary about the high ecological cost of our economic aspirations and population growth. Whereas African leaders are taking many of the proper steps to attract financial capital, frequently they are less cautious about preserving Africa's natural health and wealth. From poorly planned agriculture, settlements, infrastructure development, resource extraction, we see a drive of degradation of our forests, rivers, and grasslands. Together, we need an understanding that there is no single simple answer, and that the problems surrounding wildlife and wildlands management are inseparably linked to the complex, diverse, extremely dynamic, and multiple sectoral issues underlying Africa's broader crisis on how we manage our population, how we deal with food security, how we address poverty, how we manage our land, and especially the natural resources that offer ecological infrastructure to service our livelihoods. At African Wildlife Foundation, we hope to change the debate proposing that African governments do not have to choose conservation over development. And vice versa too, that conservation is more important than development. The two need to work together. It's a forced choice to choose development over conservation or conservation over development. The correct question is how to embrace the future and create an Africa that makes wildlife and wildlands a centerpiece of sustainable development, recognizing its unique and inherent value. Our unique generational position today challenges us to lead or support the discussion with Africa and define the place and role of wildlife and wildlands in the continent's economic development vision 2063. If we cannot find a balance between nature and economic development, we know that humans will suffer most. Conserving wildlife is key, not for tourism, but wildlife numbers are the key measurable indicators of our ability to find the balance between conservation and development. For young Africans listening, you have probably heard it being said many, many times that the future belongs to the youth. When I say the future belongs to the youth, it's really saying that you have to make a larger part of that future. The present Africa might not work for you, so you have to fix it. You are the custodian for the future. It's your time to take charge. You actually have the means. There's no excuse. You are a generation of Africans that is most educated that Africa has ever had. And technology, especially the internet, has opened the world to you in ways that the previous generation could not dream of. Yes, you are the custodian of the future. You must work for it, and you must be selfish guardian of your interests. Now, as this webinar begins, I encourage us all to shift our thinking, shift our approach towards finding a balance between nature and economic development. This will require us to think outside the box in co-creating solutions that benefit people and nature. It will require us to form and engage more in cross-conceptual platforms in order to forge solutions to both develop the continent as well as conserving our natural heritage. We must today amplify the African voice to awaken the conservation spirit in ways that will inspire all of us who view and engage this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vanessa and Dr. Sebunya. And in those opening remarks, this dialogue is about the African perspective of wildlife conservation economy. And to give us context to this perspective, we are delighted to have Sandy Shedd, the Deputy Director at the UK Treasury, who is going to give us a keynote address. And in this keynote address, she will help us unpack the theories of economics of biodiversity based on the findings of the Dasgupta report. This report was commissioned by the UK government, and Sandy was the head of the review team. So without much ado, I pass over the floor to Sandy. I don't know what the floor is called in cyberspace, but I pass it on to Sandy to take us through the theories behind the economics of biodiversity. Thank you very much, and you're welcome, Sandy, and thank you very much for accepting to be present, to include us in your rather busy schedule. Over to you.
Oh, no, thank you, Pauline. I was going to use a few slides, if that's okay, and I'm going to attempt to bring them up.
Yeah, that's okay, please.
Yeah, let me try. So, can you see that? Is that working?
We can see the slides. Yes, thank you. We can see them.
Yeah. Okay, great. So thank you very much for inviting me today. I'm really delighted to be here, and I'd like to thank both the African Civil Society Organisations, Biodiversity Alliance, and the African Development Bank for convening us. So, as you said, the ideas and approaches being discussed at today's event are obviously of huge importance to the African continent and are absolutely in tune with Professor Dasgupta's review on the economics of biodiversity. And I was privileged enough to lead the team supporting him to produce this landmark independent review, which was commissioned by the UK Treasury. And the review presents the first comprehensive economic framework of its kind for nature and calls for urgent and transformative change. And it was commissioned to understand the economic consequences of biodiversity loss, which, as we've heard from others already, are often misunderstood or overlooked. And so while many institutions, I think, today are familiar with the risks associated with climate change, which itself is a major driver of biodiversity loss, many are less clear on the economic and financial impacts of the degradation of nature. So let me start then, if I move to the next slide. Hang on. Yeah. I wanted to start with a bit of context for the review. So you can see in this slide that biodiversity is declining faster than at any time in history, with the current extinction rates around 100 to 1,000 times higher than the average rate over the past tens of millions of years, and they're accelerating. So the World Wildlife Fund's Living Planet Index, which this is taken from, shows us that between 1970 and 2016, the population of species fell by 68% on average globally. And the review highlights that this degradation of nature is a demonstration, really, that humanity's demands on nature and its services has now outstripped its ability to supply them to us on a sustainable basis. And as the review clearly states, the world's poorest countries cannot be held remotely responsible for the size of that mismatch between supply and demand today. The 670 million people living in low-income countries, mostly in, of course, sub-Saharan Africa, account for only 3% of the global ecological footprint. But I think, as Dr. Sabunya was referring to, a combination of population growth together with the need to raise material standard of living for millions of people in the region means that greater pressure is going to be put on the natural wealth of countries in Africa, which will both push the biosphere into disrepair, which is not a good thing for us globally, but most importantly, it's going to put economies and livelihoods in the region at risk. So protecting nature really is important for poverty alleviation. Let me move on to the next slide. So at the heart of the review, we frame biodiversity loss as an asset management problem. And the review explains that we've collectively not been handling the natural assets around us properly. So nature is an asset, just like roads and buildings or health and education, as it too produces a flow of goods and services over time. And we rely on nature to provide us with food, clean water, shelter, to regulate our climate and to control disease. But the review makes clear that it's not solely the role of governments or banks or businesses to properly account for natural assets in our economic decision making, because we individuals need to do that too, because ultimately we are all asset managers. Indeed, when writing the review, Professor Dasgupta wanted to make sure that the review's findings were relevant to everyone. We all rely on nature's goods and services, therefore everybody at all levels of society need to play a part in reversing the current trend of biodiversity loss that we're witnessing. And that's why actually it's very pleasing to see multilateral institutions like the African Development Bank and the Development Bank of Central African States, as well as civil society organisations and regional bodies working together to help combat this issue. Having said that we should see nature as an asset and value it properly, I want to be really clear also that the review reflects multiple sources and conceptions of value. So it recognises that nature has existence value or intrinsic value, such as sacredness. So, for example, on the existence value, we may never get to meet gorillas in the jungles of Rwanda or have no direct experience of their presence, but nevertheless ought to be protected. So these other notions of value are also important. It's not just the value we ascribe in an economic sense. Moving on then, so we need to move away from our current path, one where we're continually depleting natural capital, like our estuaries, forests, mangroves and grasslands, in some cases to the point of reaching their collapse. And we need to move towards a world in which we engage sustainably with nature. Starts with understanding and accepting a very simple truth, that our economies are embedded within nature, not external to it, and that we are embedded within nature. So accepting this, I think, forces us to recognise the limit that nature places on the economy. And by doing that, it reshapes our understanding of what truly sustainable economic development and growth looks like. So I've moved then to this slide, which summarises actually the kind of the conclusions, if you like, or the options for change that the Dasgupta review proposes. And it proposes them along three broad and interconnected transitions that are needed, with many of the actions shown here. So if I turn first to the dark green bubbles, these are focused on the need to balance. We've called this the impact equation. That's really just the balancing supply and demand. So we need to increase nature's supply relative to its current level, and we need to reduce our demand on nature. So when I say increasing nature's supply, that means not only investing in conservation projects and increasing the amount of protected areas, but also ensuring that they're well managed and used to the benefit of both nature and people. Through effective, well-coordinated efforts, it's possible to address both biodiversity loss and climate change concurrently. And so that's why the review also talks a lot about nature-based solutions that can help to address both, as well as addressing other important issues like providing jobs, supporting livelihoods and reducing poverty. And we also need to reduce humanity's overall demands on nature. So, for example, we need to shift to sustainable consumption and production patterns that account for the impact on and dependence on nature along entire supply chains. And we need to invest in women's access to education, finance, and we need to support community-based family planning and reproductive health programs. The second transition, which are the blue bubbles on this slide, are about changing our measures of success, our measures of economic success. So while standard economic measures like GDP are indispensable, so GDP is very important in short-run macroeconomic analysis, but it misleads when used to assess social well-being across generations. And so the review argues that governments need to measure and move towards more inclusive measures of wealth as the primary way of measuring economic success. Those would build a better picture of wealth and well-being across generations. And by that, I mean measures that look at the combined social value of produced human and natural capital. And finally, we need to transform our institutions and systems to ensure sustainable engagement with nature, both now and over time, and at a global scale. And so these are the orange bubbles here. We need layered institutions. So by that, I mean polycentric, that incorporate knowledge from the global, the regional, the national, and the community level. And we need to share relevant information and coordinate efforts to establish effective rules for engagement with nature and to support effective monitoring of rules and regulations. And in particular, the review focuses on two systems, our financial system and education. So the financial system will be critical to supporting a more sustainable engagement with nature. We need a financial system that channels financial investments, both public and private, towards economic activities that enhance our stock of natural assets and encourage sustainable consumption and production activities. So governments, central banks, international finance institutions, and private financial ones all have a role to play here. But of course, education is also hugely important. If we don't learn about nature, if we don't have an appreciation for nature, then we won't take sufficient action to protect it. But it's also important that grassroots voices are heard. And so this final slide really talks about the role of the citizen. And the reason I mention that is that in the review, we also talk about three pervasive features of nature: its mobility, its silence, and its invisibility. And that makes it difficult to comprehensively record our use of and impacts on the natural world. So that means that no matter how well designed our institutions are, the discipline to draw on nature sustainably must ultimately come from us as individuals, and therefore local community engagement is incredibly important for the success of conservation and restoration in particular. And the review highlights the important role played by Indigenous peoples, local communities. Indigenous peoples have often practiced biodiversity conservation through methods that have been passed down generation to generation. You, of course, all know that far better than I do. And indeed, areas under the management of Indigenous peoples are often in a better state than similar areas elsewhere. One example we draw on in the review is sacred forest legislation in Benin, where legislation protects areas considered spiritually important in local traditions. And in those regions, activities such as logging and the gathering of plants were regulated by local communities to ensure a balance between human economic activity and the natural environment. And co-management of protected areas and resources between local communities and conservation agencies or Indigenous people and government institutions offers us a really important model for how to better balance nature's ability to supply us with our demands on it. They can, of course, also provide employment opportunities and co-benefits for other problems. And another example we draw on in the review is in South Africa, where the Working for Water programme has been successful in tackling invasive non-native species. And in doing that has provided employment opportunities as well. So let me draw my presentation to a close. It's fantastic to have so many people at today's event and to see collaboration between grassroots organisations and regional institutions. And as we emerge from the current health and economic crises right around the world that have been brought about by COVID, and as we head towards two vitally important events this year for climate and environment, COP15 and COP26, we need a concerted global effort to address the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss, but that cannot happen without action and cooperation at a local level. So, as I say, it's really great to see today's event taking place, and I'd like to thank you again for the opportunity to join you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandy. Thank you very much for such a brilliant presentation, in which you've been able to bring down a highly technical report to a level that a diverse category of participants, as the ones that we have in this dialogue, can relate to. And you've been able to speak to both institutions and the individuals. And we have a very exciting lineup of men, women, youth, from indigenous and local communities across Anglo and Francophonie, East, Central, West, and Southern Africa, that have quite a couple of reflections that they would like to make. But you indicated that you have a very limited time, but I kindly wanted to request you to receive at least one of the reflections of one of the lead panelists from the CSO community, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. I have until about 1 o'clock, so we've got.
Okay.
I've got a bit of time. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yes, we have that panel of experts that is coming from those different organizations, and I would like to invite Lucy Wairungi, who is the executive director of the African Conservation Center, a Kenyan-based NGO, and she's going to speak from the perspective of civil societies that are working with local communities and giving reflections to Sunday's report. Lucy will be followed by one of the representatives from the indigenous communities. So Lucy, over to you, so that I don't waste too much of the time.
All right. Thank you, Pauline, and thank you everyone for this very exciting session. Thank you, Sandy, for that overview. I really resonated with some of the sort of outcomes. I love the box with the 3 different sort of transition points, and couldn't agree with you more on the education piece, because that's a piece I think across all our countries we are not doing well enough in creating a spirit of environmentalism from as early as we can and across all sectors. But I'd just like to point out 2 reflections in this report, working with local communities on the ground in East Africa, to again re-emphasize what you did say in the in one of your slides, the fact that most areas managed by communities are actually better managed, and also to recognize that indeed for communities, whether we speak biodiversity or we speak economics, their main concerns are their livelihoods. It's water, it's energy, it's food, it's medicine, it's building materials. They're probably not concerned about the major production units around which we report GDP. And you listen to the budget spread across all the countries. We may talk about a growing GDP, but that means nothing to them if they cannot provide food for their families, safe shelter, and a better future. And one of my first reflections is the extent to which we must now find models that are sensitive to the aspirations of the local communities. That most of our project designs, whether sometimes coming from a conservation perspective or from a development initiative, will articulate what we understand to be the benefit to local communities. But many times we are not really listening to what their end game aspirations are, and to what extent are the programs we are developing, the well-worded theory of change frameworks, really speaking to their aspirations. And so picking up from here to our local governments and also to the financing institutions, we really need to find mechanisms that enable us to understand where they intend to get to in 5, 20, 30 years. And does this pathway we are on get to their aspirations, or does it produce good to have products, but which still leave them with unmet needs and gaps of their future aspirations? My second one is on increasing productivity of nature. And you did touch on that also, not by expanding what nature produces, but by investing in its restoration and the management of the habitat and the land. We can increase productivity both for local people and for countries if the land is healthier. So really to pitch that land health is going to be central to all this. If we're to really have a positive outcome of our natural capital wealth, then the land health, which is the capstone of all the forms of use, is going to be critical. And being able to intensely focus on restoring what we are losing, and there's been very many examples that have shown that restoration increases productivity for the farmer, for the livestock keeper. It increases productivity for those who are on the marginal areas. Is probably going to be something we want to see development frameworks including. And my third and last quick point is how can we measure and report on the biodiversity impacts of the economic models. Being able to measure, quantify, monitor, and report on the depletion of biodiversity is going to help us to begin getting a grasp of understanding what we are losing and begin providing more accountability for businesses to not only report their productivity matrix, for us not to only report our consumption matrix, but to also report our depletion of my biodiversity matrix. Because then we can spend time looking at innovative ways to replenish what we're depleting, but perhaps also to be more acutely aware of the tipping point, because beyond a certain point of depletion, then there may be a point of no return, as most of these reviews have pointed out. So I'd really like to see, and not just to you, but to all of us on this panel, to really think through that measurement metrics that enables us to keep track of the status of our biodiversity as we keep track of the growth of our businesses. Thank you very much and look forward to the continued conversation.
At this point, I would also like to invite, before you respond, if I could at least get the ladies or the CSOs to make their comments. I would like to invite Hawe to make her comments, who will be followed by Payne.
Thank you for giving me the floor. Lucy, thank you. I will be sharing my experience from Cameroon. You know, Cameroon is found in the equatorial rainforest. So we have a lot of forests in Cameroon, but our forest resources and the biodiversity is reducing at an alarming rate, and the indigenous people and women in particular are most affected. So for the last 2 years today, we are working on gender and climate change community-based adaptation and mitigation to fight climate change through the conservation of the environment and its biodiversity. And we are doing this through energy efficiency, sensitization on climate change and its effects on communities and indigenous women in particular. And we also work to regenerate the indigenous knowledge, their traditional medicinal plants, medicinal trees. But we worked to regenerate this knowledge, which is being lost also because you know, younger generations are not too interested in you know, practicing or knowing this knowledge. So there is a problem of transmission of the indigenous knowledge, especially as regards to traditional medicinal plants. So one of the things that we did was energy efficiency through you know, innovating on the indigenous knowledge. But we innovated on the clay stoves using the indigenous knowledge, because we were working in pastoralist communities, and the indigenous women in these communities use cow dung, they use clay, they use dry straw to do a lot of work in their houses, to do plastering, to do a lot of decorations, and also arrange their, their cooking, their stoves, their clay stoves. But the clay stoves, mostly they are always 3-stand clay stoves. So they are stoves that lose a lot of energy. You have to use a lot of wood. Then we innovated using the same material, but did it a little bit in a scientific manner. We tested the material, the texture. We also soak it for many days. And when we created these clay stoves, which are closed, and then one clay stove can have many stands where you can stand many pots, maybe 3 pots at the same time, using just one inlet or outlet, using one inlet for wood, just a little bit quantity of wood, which can prepare 3 pots of food at the same time. So we did this and it was very successful. You have to also test the solidity of these clay stoves. We tested it scientifically to find how strong they are and how solid the stoves are, so that they can
Thank you very much, Hawe. I think that we will probably come back to you at a later stage, because right now I wanted to switch. I wanted to switch the gear a bit to the gentlemen, so we can have 2 gentlemen speak, and then we can have Sandy come back in. And I would like to speak start with.
Please, just to say that I am really in a workshop, so I don't know, you want me to submit my presentation maybe through writing? That would be better for me.
Yes, that would be fine.
You can allow me to finish, maybe 1 or 2 things, and then I go back.
Okay, just one thing, and then we move to the next person.
Yeah, so I said that with those clay stoves, the women were able to economize about 70% of wood. So in these communities, you have less wood being used. So it means that they cut the forest less, because they cut the forest less. And this also, have an effect on mitigating, because when you cut less trees, you also emit less CO2. And we also innovated with bags, which we call fireless cooking bags. So we stuff these bags, we cut them. They are also scientifically done. We cut them, we stuff them with cotton, and they can cook. They can finish cooking, and they can also preserve food for 12 hours. They can keep food hot for 12 hours. So the women economize about 200% on their resources, which they use to buy wood, and also on the wood itself. So this gave women more time to do other activities. And then we also introduced family forests. So we give women, support them to plant trees, good fruit trees, ameliorated fruit trees, and also the medicinal trees, which are disappearing, which are fast disappearing in the communities. And we also help, the exchange, transmission to the younger generation of this knowledge. So these are the things that we did, and we have scaled up. We have scaled up to many communities. The demand is very high. They want us to come to many communities, but we don't. The resources are also less. They are meager. We are not able to go to everywhere, but we have at least worked so much. We have seen the impact. The impact is really amazing, and I think that we are trying to regenerate the biodiversity with the trees that will be growing, with the medicinal trees that will be regenerated. There will be a lot of the biodiversity, and also the climate change is being mitigated. So these are the things that we have been doing for the last 2 years in our organization. It is a major activity of our organization, and we hope to work more and more on that to take it to many communities as we
Thank
can.
you very
So
much,
that
Hawe. That is a very
All right,
brilliant
thank you.
example of the kind of mobilization that women can get up to, and the kind of contribution that women, indigenous communities can get up to. And just because you signed out when you're talking about how you have transferred to the younger population, I would like to invite Khalid. Khalid is a very youthful activist from South Africa that is part of a generation of young people that have taken matters in their hands to make a contribution to biodiversity conservation. So Khalid, I would like you within 3 minutes to summarize your story. Thank you very much. Just to remind everybody, we have interpretation. There's a globe at the bottom of your screen where you should be able to select one language, and keep the questions coming and keep the conversation active in the chat. Over to you, Khalid.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Pauline. Thank you so much to all the panelists and attendees for coming to listen to us. My name is Khalid Meita. I'm from South Africa, and I joined into the environmental climate movement because I recognized it is synonymous with the injustices faced by people all over the world. Wherever you look, there is injustice, and it's caused by scarcity born of resource dispossession. So there's resource dispossession and there's accumulation in a minority, and the majority suffer because they don't have social mobility, they don't have environmental literacy, and the other capacities and dignities that come with that. And the major problem for me when I read the Dasgupta review's latest update in February this year was that it doesn't tackle that, is that it rehashes this problem and it paints biodiversity conservation against the backdrop of neoliberal capitalism. This capitalism, this accumulation by dispossession becomes the default state of the earth, and they use a lot of smart economic terms to try and repaint what has been happening all across the world. In 3 minutes, or now that I got, I think, 2 minutes left, my key arguments, the impact equations. Impact is measured by I equals PAT, which Dasgupta and his daughter even wrote about. P stands for population, affluence, and the T are actually, the T I think is standing for transformation. But the IPAT is, the T stands for technology. The IPAT equation is fundamentally flawed because it places a lot of the onus onto people who are striving for survival. If any of you have studied biology, what we're witnessing in society today is a R versus K type survival strategy, where people with the R type pursue survival, and population expansion is part of their survival. We look at population pyramids in Africa and the developing the world, they are wide at the bottom because we're trying to let our genealogy, our legacy survive. So IPAT is fundamentally flawed, and it's not a good measure of the impacts. Then we look at the measures of wealth. Measurement itself, there's a very tiny bits of intersectionality that had been incorporated into what Sandy shared, and that's because the measure fundamentally is undermined by the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. When you measure something, you lose its capacity for it to be in momentum. So you're busy gathering all the data and the baseline data to get a measure of biodiversity and the economic status of how much biodiversity is worth. You lose the idea of where it's heading. We're degrading biodiversity. So by the time you have that measurement, that accounting capacity, you've lost the value of what the biodiversity actually is doing for people. Then this transformation that Sandy spoke about, there's no mention in the Dasgupta report about transforming the way consumption and resource exploitation is happening in the global world at all. It's kind of divorced from that. So you sanitize neoliberal capitalism by putting it in the ambit of economics, and it's very disingenuous. I would like to refer all attendees, all panelists, all readers to look at some of, I'm just a single person with a critical mind. I wrote a small article, not trying to self-promote, but the references in that article discuss all of what I'm saying into much greater and more understandable detail. These are books written by anthropologists and social scientists. And critically, critically, we can't live against the backdrop of capitalism. We can't normalize this, because what's happened in the world is that every person not in charge of the financial decision making is in debt to everyone else. So the tragedy of the commons is used as some kind of rationalization to commodify nature. And on that last point, I want to say that Pan-Africanism, because I'm in South Africa, I'm born in South Africa, I consider myself an African. Pan-Africanism has recognized that the shadow price of goods that provide services for all people all around the world has been the basic costing and reverence for goods for as long as it ever has been. And when you put these other measures of commodification on them, you reduce the intrinsic value of those goods. So that's all what I wanted to kind of bring in this short amount of time. And if there's ever an opportunity, I think we can go head to head, Sandy, on some critical points. I know you're in a hurry, so thank you so much. And lastly, I'm not special. I'm one of the youth from the future, and we are seeing what's happening. We are recognizing it, and we're approaching a singularity. We're approaching a singularity where we are totally understanding the economics and the climate and the biodiversity. So prepare for more like me.
Thank you very much, Khalid. And that's the energy I wanted you to bring into the room. And Sandy, because you said you are leaving around about this time, I'm going to stop to the dialogue here, give you an opportunity to reflect on their reflections, and then we can continue the dialogue from here. Thank you very much, Khalid, Lucy, and everybody that has made the submissions. Sandy, on mute. Okay.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Pauline. And I'm sorry I can't stay for longer, because I know you're going to have a really exciting discussion and conversation. So let me just, there was a lot there, so I won't do justice to all of it, but let me sort of pick out a few of the things that I heard to sort of just offer a few quick reflections. So I think, Lucy, you talked about you talked about several things, but picking up on a couple of them. One of them, you talked about increasing the productivity of nature and the importance of investing in sort of healthy land. And absolutely, and the review speaks very, very clearly to that. In several ways, one of them being the fundamental that we need to invest in nature, and that includes sometimes just leaving nature alone, right? Investment doesn't have to cost a lot of money. It can mean just protecting areas and not going there. And also what the review does is it speaks to the limits of technology. So when we talk about productivity and efficiency, very often we assume that technology is the solution, and technology will have a really important role to play. But what the review is clear, and what Professor Dasgupta is clear, is that technology will only take us so far. So we do also need to think about investing in nature and protecting nature. Technology won't get us to the point where we use almost no nature and we can 100% recycle it without any pollution. So there are limits on technology. So absolutely, we need to invest in nature. So productivity is a really important part of why we need to do that. And you also talked about accountability, and that we need to think about the depletion of biodiversity. And I think that I agree, and in many ways that's why what the review is doing is saying we need to move beyond measures like GDP, not only because GDP are sort of short-run macro economic measures, but what GDP does is it measures flow, and actually what we need to have a better handle on is stock, and because wealth is stock. And so I feel that speaks also to your point, because if we have better measures and understanding of the stock of nature that we have, then we will be better placed to understand when we are depleting it too far. I mean, we're depleting it in aggregate too far already, but obviously there are pockets where we've already gone too far, or where we are much closer to tipping points than other places. So absolutely, this sort of measure of our stock as an understanding of both where we're going, but also to have a better understanding of the wealth that we have, the sort of natural wealth that we have. I think Hawe also, she spoke a lot there about the role of women, absolutely. So one of the things the review doesn't do is we don't talk a huge amount about gender and the role of women, but other reports have done that, and the IPBES work, so that's the intergovernmental panel looking at biodiversity. So they do talk a lot about the role of women, and so the gender dimensions, if you like, of biodiversity loss. But we do absolutely recognise in the review the important role that women play. And it's fantastic actually to have heard from Hawe a really practical, tangible example on the ground there in Cameroon, where women have been able to economise and reduce the amount of wood that they are using. And I say again, as I said at the beginning, which is the review is clear that the problem we face globally is not a problem where Africa, sort of the poorest countries in the world, are responsible. Absolutely not. But the direction of travel that we're going in, and the models of development that we have had to date, the examples that countries like the UK have set are not good examples to follow. And so increasingly, these issues will be important for countries like Cameroon, others in Africa, because these are about livelihoods, about jobs, about health, about putting food on the table for people. So they are as relevant to poverty alleviation as they are to notions of globalization and trade flows. Which I guess leads me then on to some of the points that Khalid made, like I don't know enough about some of the issues that he was raising and discussing. So I won't sort of try to answer those. But what I will say is that the review does talk about the need to address consumption and production, and our patterns of consumption and production. So I'd encourage you to sort of look at it again, because I think some of the issues that you raise are tackled and are addressed in the review, but obviously it doesn't tackle everything. And it's very clear that responsibility, yes, there's the responsibility of individuals, but it's also the responsibility of governments, of international institutions. So everybody needs to play a role here. So I hope that sort of addresses some of Khaled's points, but obviously not all of them. I hope that's helpful. I'm sorry I can't stay for longer, but I know you're going to have a really, really exciting further discussion and conversation. And thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you again. Thank you very much, Sandy. Yes, of course, that has been very, very useful feedback and reflection on our reflections. It's been a pleasure having you in this discussion, and hopefully we will continue interacting and exchanging ideas. But like I said, the report was a very good report. It provides context, and it's from that background and basis that we requested for you to invited you to come present us that context so that it can guide our dialogue. And you have done a brilliant job at it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Having you. Yeah. Yes. As we continue with our discussion, I would like to conclude the CSO, to invite the remaining participants from the CSO perspective before we switch the baton to the regional institutions. I would like to invite Ousmane. I would like to invite Ousmane. Ousmane, I think you're going to speak in French, or let me wait and hear. I would like to give the floor to Ousmane, to speak to us. So if you haven't, so if you haven't yet switched, please.
I will speak to French.
Okay. So participants, if you haven't yet clicked on the button for translation, Ousmane is going to speak in French. You can select the English channel to listen to him. Over to you, Ousmane.
Merci beaucoup. Donc, je voudrais vraiment me joindre aux félicitations des uns et des autres, et surtout par rapport à l'invitation que vous nous avez faite à cet important webinaire. Je voudrais juste partager quelques expériences que vous voyez ici en matière d'économie de la biodiversité que nous sommes en train de dérouler ici au Sénégal avec l'ONG Enda Energy. Comme vous le savez, c'est une ONG, une organisation de la société civile qui travaille sur les questions d'énergie, de changement climatique, mais aussi sur des questions de gouvernance locale en appuyant donc les communautés à bien conserver les écosystèmes comme les zones l'ont dit tout à l'heure, qui servent véritablement de base économique, mais aussi de survie pour ces populations-là. Alors, comme vous le voyez ici, nous intervenons sur un certain nombre d'approches. Par rapport à cette approche que vous voyez ici, d'abord, il s'agit de développer des outils de régulation parce que si vous êtes avec des acteurs qui partagent les mêmes ressources, il y a forcément donc une compétition parce que là, on est en phase avec une pluralité d'acteurs. Et donc, c'est toujours utile donc de faire en sorte qu'on organise donc la gestion, qu'on organise l'exploitation de ces ressources-là. Raison pour laquelle nous intervenons au niveau de la zone centre du Sénégal, dans la région donc de Fatick, avec une forte couverture d'un écosystème assez fragile qui se trouve être les écosystèmes de mangrove, mais aussi il y a aussi l'écosystème terrestre qui sont à la fois aussi affectés par des questions d'érosion côtière, par des questions de salinité des terres, etc., etc. Donc, du coup, l'économie donc, de ces différentes zones-là est menacée donc, par la variabilité des changements climatiques. Alors, là aussi, nous mettons en avant ce que nous appelons le développement des filières, qui va dans le sens du développement de l'économie verte dans ces zones-là. Et là, nous avons un certain nombre de filières que nous sommes en train donc, de promouvoir dans cette zone-là, notamment la pêche durable, d'autres filières comme l'apiculture, l'ostréiculture et la valorisation des produits forestiers non ligneux. Nous avons dans notre orientation l'esprit de former les acteurs parce qu'on parle d'économie, il faut véritablement non seulement sensibiliser, mais former les acteurs sur l'entrepreneuriat et les aider donc à développer leurs propres entreprises dans le domaine non seulement de la protection de la biodiversité, mais combiner les deux, c'est-à-dire en faisant la protection, mais de l'autre côté aussi, on essaie de générer des revenus. Donc, comme vous le voyez ici, en matière, je ne sais pas si, voilà, je vais essayer d'agrandir. Voilà, merci. Voilà, donc là, c'est juste un exemple de règles de gestion au niveau de l'AMP du Gandou qui se trouve dans cette zone centre-là. On a essayé donc d'organiser donc les acteurs autour de la réglementation de ces ressources-là. Et la principale ressource qui se trouve dans cette zone-là, ce sont les pêcheries. Et là, donc, comme avec les questions de changement climatique, on l'a dit tout à l'heure, on assiste donc à une diminution drastique de ces ressources-là. Il faut véritablement organiser les acteurs et faire des mesures de gestion. Et là, on a essayé donc de faire en sorte que les habitats des poissons puissent être reconstruits. Parce que si vous faites la pêche, il y a une surpression sur la ressource. Il y a une augmentation de la demande, il y a une augmentation des prises. Je pense qu'en ce moment-là, il faut penser véritablement à voir comment reconstituer, comment rendre de façon beaucoup plus abondante cette ressource-là. Et là, nous avons introduit des technologies qui permettent donc aux poissons de retrouver donc leurs habitats. Je pense que la question de la technologie, on l'a soulevé tout à l'heure, c'est extrêmement important, mais aussi de faire en sorte que autour donc de ces écosystèmes très fragiles qui sont tout à fait dégradés, d'essayer donc de les régénérer. Raison pour laquelle nous avons des programmes de reboisement, nous avons également des programmes de mise en défense permettant justement donc à redonner donc cet écosystème-là ses fonctions et ses services écologiques. Donc là, vous voyez, nous intervenons sur ces trois filières. D'abord, nous avons la filière aquaculture, donc qui consiste justement donc à l'élevage en perspective, en l'élevage des poussins, des poissons, autant pour moi. Et nous avons également la culture des jarches, que nous appelons communément, ensemencement des jarches. Nous avons aussi la culture des huîtres que nous appelons l'ostréiculture. Et c'est des activités que nous sommes en train de développer tout au long de la filière, c'est-à-dire de la production jusqu'à la commercialisation. Mais également l'apiculture qui consiste également à élever donc des abeilles dans ces écosystèmes de mangroves et de faire en sorte que le produit puisse être commercialisé sur le marché local, voire national. Nous avons également mis en avant la question de la technologie qui nous semble extrêmement importante parce que pour nous, il faut combiner deux choses, c'est-à-dire l'offre de reboisement, c'est-à-dire l'offre de conservation et la demande de conservation. Parce que si vous êtes en amont, en essayant donc de régénérer cet écosystème-là, en essayant donc de faire des reboisements, en essayant de faire du mise en défaut, alors qu'en amont, les facteurs qui dégradent cet écosystème-là ne sont pas pris en compte, le travail risque donc d'être voué à l'échec. Raison pour laquelle, pour les groupements avec qui nous travaillons, on essaie donc non seulement de les former, de les organiser, mais aussi de faire en sorte qu'ils utilisent les équipements de cuisson propres, c'est-à-dire des foyers améliorés, des fours améliorés, parce que ces zones-là, la mangrove déjà, le bois vert de mangrove est interdit d'exploitation. Le seul bois qui est autorisé, donc c'est le bois mort, et c'est tout à fait difficile de trouver donc ce bois mort-là souvent dans ces forêts-là. Et là aussi, nous accompagnons les activités génératrices, d'autres activités génératrices de revenus telles que la boulangerie, qui également est un moyen donc de pression, parce qu'il y a une forte pression de beaucoup de prélèvements qui se font au niveau de la mangrove à des fins de bois énergie pour la boulangerie. Donc, de façon très ramassée, voilà donc un exemple l'ostréiculture, la culture des jasses en image. Vous avez également l'ostréiculture que nous avons développée et nous accompagnons également ces groupements-là dans ce sens-là. Nous avons l'apiculture, comme vous le voyez aussi en image. Donc, et c'est, comme je l'ai dit tantôt, c'est toute la chaîne que nous appuyons, mais également par rapport aux produits forestiers non ligneux, parce que nous ne sommes pas seulement dans les zones humides, mais nous travaillons aussi sur la terre ferme avec la valorisation donc, des produits forestiers, notamment le Balanis test egyptiaca. Et là, vous voyez ici, en termes de conservation, on a essayé donc de faire en sorte qu'on ait autour de toute la chaîne de conservation des groupements qui utilisent de l'énergie propre, donc pour ne plus se rendre dans la mangrove, mais également qui utilisent des foyers améliorés permettant justement de limiter cette coupe de bois mangrove avec une approche d'entrepreneuriat. Donc, vous voyez ici, donc ça, c'est les différentes technologies qu'on a, et j'en ai parlé de groupement. Mais ce qui est très important également dans cette approche d'intervention, c'est véritablement non seulement former, mais développer le marché. C'est là justement que nous tissons le partenariat avec d'autres acteurs qui se positionnent sur le marché, permettant donc justement donc à nos opérateurs, à nos groupements de mieux vendre leurs produits vers les marchés les plus élargis. Et ça, nous utilisons également la technologie. Nous avons donc des applications, n'est-ce pas, pour la vente de ces produits-là. Et on a tout développé avec des partenaires pour faciliter la commercialisation de ces produits-là. En perspective, il s'agit véritablement pour nous c'est une expérience, je l'ai dit tantôt, locale, mais de densifier, mais de renforcer également le développement de ces filières-là, notamment l'apiculture, l'ostréiculture, mais également l'usage des technologies sobres en carbone, c'est-à-dire des technologies qui utilisent très peu d'énergie, mais également l'énergie durable. La question de l'énergie durable est extrêmement importante pour nous, pour justement renforcer la valorisation des filières, parce que dans le process de transformation de ces filières-là, souvent on a besoin donc de l'énergie pour faire cette transformation-là. Raison pour laquelle on est en train donc de promouvoir de l'énergie propre dans même plusieurs secteurs, y compris le secteur de l'élevage, n'est-ce pas, pour la valorisation du lait local. Donc, on l'a fait un peu partout au Sénégal, au nord, au sud, et on est en train donc de lancer un nouveau programme au centre pour la valorisation du lait local à partir donc, de l'énergie durable. Donc, voilà de façon un peu ramassée donc, notre expérience qui est très locale, que j'avais véritablement à partager avec vous, pour vous dire que l'économie de la biodiversité est extrêmement importante parce que ça sous-tend l'économie locale. Les populations,
thank you very much.
Que cette économie-là, pour pouvoir survivre, pour pouvoir se prendre en charge, mais pour nous, il faut les accompagner, il faut les former, il faut véritablement les coacher, les assister pour pouvoir les permettre à tirer mieux de profit de cette économie-là. Je vous remercie.
Okay, thank you very much, Usman. That is a very exciting example of of how institutions in Africa are having their efforts in contributing to biodiversity CSO representation. But I'm going to switch the gear a bit and hand it over to the regional institutions, the regional financial institutions, the regional banking institutions. As we mentioned in the beginning, we have a dialogue that is bringing many perspectives on the table. So now I would like to switch it back to switch the gears a bit and hand it over to the regional economic bodies and the development finance institutions. And these are organizations that are currently participating in implementing the Africa Green Fund. We have representation from ECOWAS by Musa Leko. And then we also have representation from the Central Africa States Development Bank, and that is Noor Abdrasul. We also we'll also bring Vanessa back. Vanessa gave us the opening remarks. And I have one question for these financing institutions. Listening to Sandy, as well as listening to the reflections from the civil society organizations and individuals, how well do you feel your institutions have aligned themselves to promoting a conservation economy that delivers tangible benefits from Africa? You had in Sandy's presentation, she said that one of the most critical factors is going to be the financial flows that affect investments. So we would like to hear from you, starting with Musa, on how well you feel your institutions have aligned themselves to be able to deliver this kind of enabling environment that will deliver the interests and tangible benefits for the Africa society. Over to you, Musa.
Ok, merci pour cette introduction. Donc, je me présente, je m'appelle Moussa Leko, je suis directeur par intérim de l'environnement et ressources naturelles de la CEDEAO, Communauté économique des États de l'Afrique de l'Ouest. Donc, par rapport à la thématique du jour, effectivement, la commission de la CEDEAO, donc depuis 2008, a adopté une politique environnementale que nous appelons ECOWAS Environmental Policy. Donc, ça a été adopté par les chefs d'État en décembre 2018. Donc, je voudrais dire que, peut-être pour ceux qui ne connaissent pas la CEDEAO, donc c'est une communauté économique des États de l'Afrique qui rassemble 15 États de l'Afrique occidentale et à peu près pour une population estimée à plus de 300 millions d'habitants.
Do we still have Musa? I can't hear anything.
Yeah, j'ai un problème de connexion. I have an issue with the network. Comments. OK, donc je disais que la communauté, la CEDEAO, Communauté économique des États de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, donc rassemble 15 États membres, à peu près une population de 300 millions d'habitants. Je disais que la communauté économique des États de l'Afrique, en tant que groupe d'intégration, organisation d'intégration, donc dans le domaine de la gestion durable de la biodiversité et de la promotion des filières relatives à la biodiversité, nous pouvons citer que la CEDEAO, dans le cadre de la mise en œuvre de sa politique environnementale, donc a développé un plan ouest-africain de gestion des écosystèmes forestiers, parce que la région, elle est dotée en ressources aussi assez suffisantes, estimées à presque 72,1 millions d'hectares sous forme des terres forestières, incluant donc des forêts primaires estimées à 4,2 millions d'hectares et à peu près 66,2 millions d'hectares de forêts secondaires et des plantations, donc d'à peu près 1,7 million d'hectares. Et pour les zones protégées, les aires protégées, donc on compte environ 52 aires protégées couvrant à peu près 27,7 millions d'hectares. Donc, voyez-vous, en termes donc, de ressources relatives donc, à la préservation des ressources au niveau de la région, la CEDEAO donc, a élaboré, dans le cadre de la mise en œuvre de sa politique, un plan de convergence pour la gestion et l'utilisation durable des écosystèmes forestiers en Afrique de l'Ouest. Donc, ce plan de convergence qui est basé sur 7 domaines prioritaires d'intervention, notamment l'harmonisation des cadres politiques, juridiques et réglementaires de la gestion des ressources forestières au niveau de l'espace. Le deuxième point concernait de faire le point donc, sur le potentiel en termes des ressources forestières et la dynamique de ces ressources. Donc, je voudrais dire l'évolution de ces ressources. Le troisième point concerne la restauration des paysages dégradés et la gestion des écosystèmes forestiers au niveau de la sous-région. Le quatrième point concerne la conservation de la biodiversité donc l'économie bioéconomie qui nous concerne aujourd'hui. Et le cinquième point donc, qui concerne la valorisation de la biodiversité en vue de l'atteinte des objectifs écologiques, de la sécurité alimentaire et aussi en vue de paiement des services écosystémiques au niveau de la sous-région. Donc, le deuxième
Thank you very much, Musa. I would now like to invite Noor Abdrasul from from the Central Africa States Development Bank to give his reflection still within the same question of how well he feels their institution has been aligned to deliver benefits, tangible benefits for Africa. Over to you. Is he still with us? We've probably lost him. No, but I can see Noor. Noor, you're there, but you are in mute.
I'm
If
hearing.
you would like that we first hear from
Hello?
Vanessa
Sorry.
before we hear from you, that's okay.
No, I want to sum up just to present.
I think as we wait
what
to
are
hear
the
from
key
Noor,
message.
Vanessa, can you please respond to that same question? Where is Vanessa? Vanessa, I can see you. I think you're still there. As we wait for Noor to get ready. So Vanessa, how well do you feel the Africa Development Bank has aligned itself to be able to deliver tangible benefits for Africa?
So thank you so much to Pauline and to the previous speakers for what has been a very interesting discussion today. And of course, the bank considers biodiversity and nature to be central to its strategic agenda on the transition to green growth. And this is demonstrated by our commitment to co-organizing this webinar with civil society and with other development finance institutions in the region. So I'm going to speak on three separate themes.
Vous m'écoutez là?
Is someone speaking?
Oui, allô?
Is there someone else?
Carry on, Vanessa, it's your flow. Noor will come in after you.
Okay, thank you.
Hello.
So as I said,
Hello?
I'll speak on three themes. Maybe he should mute. Yeah, thank you.
Hello. Hello.
On three themes. First is on nature-based solutions. Second is on nature-based finance and investments. And third is on the enhanced valuation of nature. So the bank's approach is structured around these three modes of intervention in supporting African countries. I should say more broadly that we are beginning to align our strategic frameworks and policies on this green agenda. So whether it's on energy, on agriculture, on water, and infrastructure, within the bank, we're looking at how we can better align our policies, our systems, our operational frameworks. So I mentioned in the opening remarks on the Great Green Wall Initiative, which is looking to harness desert solar power to provide around 10,000 megawatts of electricity to 11 countries in the Sahel region. So that's a very important example of a large-scale nature-based solution that the bank is deploying in the quest for green growth and to reduce the ecological footprint of its operations. Secondly is, so I mentioned the Great Green Wall Initiative, the Desert to Power Initiative as well, which is also looking to harness solar energy in the desert or Sahel region and support 250 million people. So thirdly, let me talk about the work we're doing on nature-based solutions, again, on another scale. So as some of you may be aware, the bank is supporting the Global Center on Adaptation. It's Africa Center, which we are hosting. And there's also been some initiatives on accelerating adaptation as well. So there's a very strong focus on that. A good example is some work we're doing under the Africa Ecological Futures Initiative in collaboration with our partners, UN Environment, WWF, and others. And we're looking at how nature-based solutions can be used in infrastructure, starting with the pilots on the petroleum and mining sectors and how water can be more sustainably managed. Again, how we can advise and align investments in water and how this can be used in the long term to channel finance on resource extraction. So we're looking to launch this major initiative at the COP26, and I ask all of you to stay engaged with us. More broadly, we're looking at nature-based solutions being applied to infrastructure development, to cities, urban planning, and even to agroecology. So this is a central theme that we're exploring. And again, an important initiative which we've started is on mainstreaming natural capital in African development finance in collaboration with the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership, which I mentioned again in my opening remarks. But this has 4 components. First of all is on applying natural capital to infrastructure finance. And we've done a pilot of a hydropower project in Tanzania. The results are out and we're planning to launch that with our partners later this year. But it's interesting to see when you have the natural capital risk more clearly identified, what types of investment decisions do you make? So we hope to apply this approach to other countries. We're looking at, for instance, doing this in Mozambique, in Madagascar, elsewhere in Africa. So it's a very interesting approach, and I'm sure that partners and stakeholders will be keen to learn more about that. Second, in this program is engaging with other multilateral development banks to make a business case for investing in natural capital and biodiversity. So we're relating with our colleagues and peers in the World Bank and the other regional development banks along these lines. The third is looking at sovereign credit ratings for African countries. And this was one of the important messages that Sandy highlighted in her presentation on how we understand nature and its incorporation in national wealth. So we're looking at that as part of this program. And then finally, we're trying to build capacity for natural capital accounting and assessment in decision-making. So we plan to run a natural capital academy, which we're now developing through the African Development Institutes of the bank. And this will support decision makers, particularly those in government and the private sector, on using natural capital to make better decisions and better planning towards sustainable development. So in general, there's been a focus on ecosystem restoration, whether it's land, forest, or marine habitats, and also on afforestation, on desertification, as part of our broader strategy on climate change and green growth. Some of our colleagues are here, perhaps they may be able to speak to this later. And then we're even looking at blue economy opportunities, looking at fisheries value chains, sustainable aquaculture, and ecotourism. So I think in essence, there's a holistic approach that the bank is now adopting, but the emphasis is on embedding nature. So whether it's on in our finance, in operations, in investments, even in policy tools that we're using to inform decision-making, is really very central to how we move forward. And I think there are opportunities for us to engage with African civil society through the Global Biodiversity Framework and through other processes which are ongoing. And we look forward to continuing this very constructive discussion and identifying areas for specific collaboration and support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Over to you, Noor. You can take the floor now.
Hello?
Noor, you are on mute, and we can't see your video, but you're on mute. If you could unmute yourself and then make your comment. Thank you.
Allô?
Allô?
Allô? C'est bon? Madame? Vous
Yes, we
m'écoutez?
can hear you. We can hear you. Yes, please go ahead. We can hear you.
OK, merci. En tout cas, je vous remercie pour l'opportunité que vous avez donnée à la BDAC pour vous présenter l'expérience de la BDAC dans la gestion de la biodiversité. La Banque de développement des États de l'Afrique centrale, institution commune de financement du développement des États de la CEMAC, les États membres, ça c'est une institution de la CEMAC. Les États membres de cette institution sont nous avons la République du Cameroun, la République centrafricaine, le Congo, le Gabon, la Guinée équatoriale et le Tchad. En ligne droite avec sa mission, la Banque œuvre depuis sa création à promouvoir le développement économique des États membres et à réaliser l'intégration économique de l'Afrique centrale. Donc, la protection de la biodiversité par voie de conséquence représente une forme de gestion des ressources naturelles ayant comme principal objectif de maintenir les ressources biologiques de la planète dont dépendent les besoins et les aspirations des générations futures. Il s'agit donc d'un principe fondamental du développement durable et doit s'inscrire dans les travaux des institutions du développement, comme la Banque de développement des États de l'Afrique centrale. Avant qu'on puisse rentrer dans le vif du sujet, nous allons faire un état des lieux des ressources naturelles au niveau du bassin du Congo. Mesdames et messieurs les participants à cette importante réunion, nous sommes au niveau du bassin du Congo. Si on parle de les régions du bassin du Congo, le bassin du Congo dispose d'énormes potentialités. Il y a beaucoup d'enjeux au sein de la CEMAC. Nous avons les enjeux qui sont liés à l'environnement, nous avons la dégradation des terres. Il y a des problèmes de dégradation des terres au niveau du bassin du Congo. Nous avons la déforestation et la perte de la biodiversité, puisque chaque année, environ presque 12% de notre superficie forestière, avec les activités régaliennes, ont des impacts directs sur les ressources naturelles. Nous avons également une diversité des ressources en eau, puisque nous sommes au niveau du bassin du Congo, il y a des bassins hydrographiques qui sont vraiment riches. Nous avons également des bassins versants et nous avons beaucoup de bassins. Nous avons également des paysages, nous avons beaucoup des enjeux, la forêt dense, humide, sempervirente, c'est-à-dire la forêt qui garde toutes leurs feuilles pendant une année, 2 années. Nous avons des espèces emblématiques qui sont aussi au niveau de l'Afrique centrale. Nous avons également les faunes. Les faunes sont diversifiées, très fructueuses. Nous avons beaucoup des espèces fauniques. Nous avons également tout ce qu'on appelle quelques espèces phares. Nous avons également les aires protégées. Donc, pour vous dire qu'au niveau de l'Afrique centrale, nous avons beaucoup la zone de l'Afrique centrale constitue ce qu'on appelle le réservoir de la biodiversité. Donc, comme je vous avais dit à l'introduction, la BDAC, c'est une institution de financement. La BDAC, dans sa ligne droite, intervient dans le cadre de la protection de la biodiversité du bassin du Congo. Nous allons vous partager notre démarche dans la gestion de cette biodiversité. Donc, je vais vous parler ici du principe, procédure et directive de la BDAC en matière de la gestion de biodiversité. 2 principes au moins sont appliqués directement à la biodiversité ou à la diversité biologique par la Banque des États de l'Afrique centrale. Les principes sont, nous avons, la BDAC contribue à la conservation des espèces menacées et des habitats fragiles. Donc, nous, on veille sur ça. La BDAC assure la protection et la gestion des espaces naturels. D'autres aspects sur la question de la biodiversité peuvent être soulevés par la BDAC si c'est nécessaire. Aussi, la BDAC ne financera-t-elle pas de projet, la BDAC ne financera pas-t-il de projets de nature à endommager l'environnement de façon sérieuse ou réversible, ce qui n'inclurait pas de mesures d'atténuation acceptables pour la banque. Elle ne finance pas des projets qui altèrent singulièrement les zones naturelles considérées par les conventions internationales comme étant des sites patrimoine mondial ou des réserves de biosphère qui, selon la législation nationale, appartiennent aux parcs nationaux, aux aires protégées et à la question de la faune et la flore sauvage. Donc, notre procédure dispose ce qu'on appelle la liste d'exclusion des projets qui touchent les questions de biodiversité, nous sommes très regardants sur ces questions. Au niveau de la pertinence par rapport aux investissements de la banque, les exemples suivants appartiennent aux activités de développement dont les conséquences peuvent être particulièrement néfastes pour la biodiversité. Nous avons les projets d'agriculture, d'élevage qui comportent des opérations de défrichement, l'élimination des milieux humides, la submersion des terres destinées à l'installation des bassins de retenue, le déplacement des espèces fauniques causées par l'établissement des clôtures, des animaux, etc. Les projets de pêche comprenant la conservation importante d'importants lieux naturels. Les projets forestiers qui comportent la construction des routes, l'exploitation intensive, l'implication d'industries dans une zone forestière, par exemple. Les questions, par exemple, de projets de transport qui ont pour objet de la construction des routes principales, tout ça, toutes ces questions, nous avons notre directive. Nous veillons très strictement pour que la BDAC ne contribue pas à la dégradation de l'environnement. Nous avons notre liste d'exclusion, nous avons notre procédure, nous déterminons tout ce qui est les impacts de la biodiversité. Et donc, si ça touche les questions des aires protégées, la BDAC ne peut pas assister à ce projet. Donc, pour cela, la BDAC ne finance pas des projets qui appartiennent à toutes ces catégories. En ce cas, pour influencer sur la gestion de la protection des ressources biologiques et promouvoir la préservation de la biodiversité, en sélectionnant les projets. Nous, on sélectionne les projets, on participe à leur préparation et au processus de leur évaluation environnementale et sociale. Et à leur évaluation et exécution en apportant les recommandations eu égard des stratégies de développement national et sectoriel. Donc, pour vous dire quoi, à ce niveau, la BDAC participe également à des missions. Il sélectionne des projets selon sa procédure, selon la liste d'exclusion et participe à des missions de terrain et évalue ces projets. Pour évaluer ces projets, nous avons notre ligne directrice pour l'évaluation des impacts environnementaux. Donc, à travers ce qu'on appelle le système de gestion environnementale et sociale, qu'on appelle EGS, qui était un outil de la planification environnementale. C'est ça qui nous a permis de déterminer les impacts de projet, c'est-à-dire toute incidence que peut avoir un projet sur la biodiversité. Donc, de préférence, parmi les questions importantes devront être considérées lors de son examen préliminaire. On pourra définir le traitement accordé à ces questions et reconnaître tout autre enjeu à prendre en considération au cours d'une reconnaissance du milieu effectuée dans le cadre de missions préparatoires. Donc, après cela, nous demandons tout ce qui est ce qu'on appelle les études environnementales et sociales qui pourraient effectuer en conjonction avec l'élaboration du projet. Donc, la liste succincte qui permet d'identifier rapidement les problèmes liés à la biodiversité. On identifie les types spécifiques d'écosystèmes sur lesquels le projet peut être proposé. Si c'est des forêts, si c'est des zones humides, si c'est les savanes. Et on va voir si c'est des habitats naturels qui a un intérêt particulier ou encore qui ont été désignés comme étant des sites naturels d'importance nationale et internationale. Nous analysons également les aspects biologiques importants des écosystèmes en précisant par exemple le type d'habitat. On va veiller, on veille sur ces questions, on veille sur les espèces menacées, on veille sur la reproduction ou la nidation de certaines espèces. On regarde également la nature générale de l'impact du projet sur les écosystèmes, tels que les activités de déboisement, le drainage par exemple, les régimes hydrologiques, la facilité d'accès, la circulation routière, les bruits, tout ça. Notre système de gestion environnementale veille à ce document, à ce traitement sur la biodiversité. On estime également l'importance des effets négatifs sur l'ensemble des écosystèmes et les effets cumulatifs sur ce système. Donc, il est très, très probable pour la BDAC de travailler avec les ministères en charge des questions qui traitent directement les questions de biodiversité. Il s'agit pour cela le ministère en charge de l'environnement, le ministère en charge de forêt. Et donc, Et souvent, on peut demander au niveau du ministère de charge des questions forestières de nous fournir, par exemple, la liste, par exemple, des inventaires nationaux de la faune et de la flore. On regarde ces aspects, on va voir l'évolution de ces stocks, on va voir tout ce qui est inventaire des ressources en bois, ou soit si c'est des ressources halieutiques, c'est-à-dire des espèces en général. On peut voir aussi, on va analyser ces projets conformément au programme de suivi et de l'état de l'évolution des ressources biologiques. Et on peut travailler également, si possible, avec des centres de recherche, des ONG qui sont dans la zone, par exemple les WWF, les WRI, ainsi de suite. Et pour cela, nous déterminons des outils institutionnels pouvant atténuer ces impacts. Nous disposons de ce qu'on appelle la législation, les politiques sectorielles en matière de la biodiversité. Nous utilisons ça et nous verrons également tout ce qui est la collaboration entre les organismes, les questions de l'agriculture, les questions de la pêche, les questions des ressources minérales, l'énergie, eau, espace, et ainsi de suite. Nous verrons également les commerces qui touchent un peu la biodiversité, conformément à la Convention internationale sur les espèces en danger. Et nous allons regarder toutes ces procédures et à travers les analyses, à travers les impacts déterminés, nous allons renforcer les mesures d'atténuation pour la protection de ces écosystèmes. Donc, voilà tout ça, ces mesures-là. Et parallèlement, au niveau de la banque est en train de mettre en place des stratégies pour son positionnement stratégique au niveau des questions de la biodiversité. La banque est actuellement deliver partenaire dans le cadre du processus d'accréditation au fonds vert. Nous sommes en train de boucler notre processus d'accréditation. Nous avons également dans la démarche de domiciliation des fonds bleus du bassin du Congo. Nous sommes en train de travailler avec la Convention cadre des Nations Unies sur l'environnement.
We are slowly running out of time. I hope you are summarizing, Noor.
Et voilà, nous sommes une banque de développement. Nous sommes en train de travailler à mobiliser des ressources pour soutenir les questions de biodiversité en Afrique centrale. Nous sommes en train de renforcer notre leadership dans la sous-région sur cette question de la biodiversité. Nous sommes en train de marquer et renforcer notre présence dans les instances de décision ou de négociation sur les questions de biodiversité. Donc, voilà, c'est l'ambition de la BDAC. La BDAC a pour ambition donc, de faire donc les questions de la biodiversité un nouveau pôle de croissance pour les États de l'Afrique centrale. Et je vous remercie pour le temps que vous avez donné à la BDAC pour cette présentation. Je vous remercie.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Noor. Thank you, Musa. Thank you, Vanessa, for giving us the perspectives and some confidence, some level of confidence that our financial institutions, our banking institutions clearly understand the role they have to play to be able to make this happen. We are slowly running out of time, and there is so much, there are so many questions, there are comments, but I think I'm afraid I'm going to invite Yemi to make a summary of the messages that have come through. This discussion will continue, even offline, the discussion will continue. But there was one particular question that had been put in the chat, and I would like one of our local communities, one of the representatives of the local communities to be the one to respond to that question. And that question was to do with the fact that many of these documents, and surveys like this, really do not tackle the realities on the ground. And I would like to invite Payne. I'm giving you 1 minute to be able to answer that question as Yemi is preparing to share with us the summary of what has come out, and then we hand over to Zeneb to close the session. Payne, and I'm timing you exactly 1 minute. You make your intervention, and then Yemi comes in.
So thank you, Pauline. 1 minute is very short, but yes, we are talking about biodiversity, conservation, and livelihoods of local people. And we have all acknowledged that local people play a big role in conserving and also maintaining the biodiversity of our lands. And I think to answer the question, as much as they are doing so much, there is no recognition as to the efforts they are putting into conservation and conservation. But again, also, they are also suffering from, conserving the lands in which they live in. There is expansion of protected areas, which affects negatively their livelihoods. We are talking about forceful evictions of local communities to pave way for exclusive conservation. And we have seen that inclusive conservation tends to work more than exclusive conservation. And this is where the role of local communities is seen. Their efforts, they don't need payment to do conservation that they do on their daily lives. And, the West is investing a lot in conservation, but also pushing for exclusive conservation, which is affecting the livelihoods of people. We are talking about eviction of communities from their lands they've lived, they've conserved for so many years. So these are some of the negative negative impacts of communities conserving and taking care of the land the natural way. Thank you, Pauline, back to you.
Thank you very much, Payne. I'm so glad I forwarded that question to you. You have so eloquently responded to it. Yemi, over to you. If you could just share with us the key messages that are coming out of here before we hand it over to Zeneb to close the session. The chat has been abuzz with quite a few messages, and the Q&A has also been having a number of submissions that have been responded to. Yemi, are you ready?
Yeah, excuse me. So thank you very much, Pauline. And thanks to all the presenters and also those that have been able to listen into this webinar. Obviously, there's no way I can do justice to the diversity and the richness of the perspectives that have been presented around this whole issue of the conservation economy, its importance. And I think the stage was set by Vanessa and Kadu on the importance of partnerships, that we need to listen to all the voices. We need to look at the perspectives of the development finance the regional development institutions, the development finance institutions, but also we need to listen to the voices of those that are living and with nature, that are deriving their livelihoods from nature, which are the local voices, indigenous people and local communities, and begin to understand each other. What are some of the interventions that are taking place with respect to these investment institutions, whether they are banks or just development entities, and that we need to have an African perspective because of the importance of the African continent with respect to biodiversity. We need to listen to the youth perspectives, and we need to understand the context, because if we're talking about the economy, biodiversity economy within Africa, we need to understand this context. And this context is also at the local level. And then we had the keynote address by Sandy. And I think that the key message from Sandy is really that our lives and our economies are embedded in nature. And yet we have not taken nature seriously enough in terms of how we make decisions, how we make policies, how we are investing. in our nature-based economies. So that was really one of the, the first points. I think the second point that was emerging is that, look, the nature-based economy is very complex. And one group that seems to understand this complexity very well are local communities and indigenous people. And so it's really important that we create the spaces, that we create democratic spaces that enable us to hear how these local communities are living with nature, how they understand the value of nature, that it's not just about the economic value of nature, but also the intrinsic values of nature, and that the way they understand the value of water is very different from an economic perspective. So we need to create the democratic spaces to understand how they manage and how they benefit from this nature, and to see how we can scale this up. And that nature itself is very interesting in that it also lends itself to participation, and therefore we need to take advantage to ensure that we create this participation with respect to all the actors. We then came to the perspectives of the grassroots, and this was led by Lucy. And I think what emerged from Lucy's intervention is this thing that we need to look at different models and tools of assessing growth, that GDP on its own as a measure of how well we are doing is not sufficient, and that we need to look at other tools that tell us how well we are doing with respect to economic development. And this brings us back again to understanding the context, understanding the local level, and how local communities are dealing with these things. And that importantly, we need to look at increasing productivity of nature. So it's not just when we talk about biodiversity economy, it's not just the financial investments that are being made, whether it's by banks or private sector companies, but also how we ensure that we are investing in the health of nature, the health of the land, and that sometimes doing nothing, leaving nature alone, is in itself an investment that we need to take that into account. And then there was the point around that we need to be able to measure and to quantify and to be able to report on how biodiversity is being used. So it's not just consuming species and nature, but also understanding how this is taking place, the extent of the management that is going into this interaction between humans and nature. We had perspectives from Cameroon, and excellent examples, I think, were given by Howard on some of the work that they're doing in terms of energy efficiency and education and supporting women in this role. We had a very animated intervention by Khalid on sort of a youth activist perspective and raising issues and concerns around relying too much on liberal economics. Then we had intervention from Senegal by Usman, some of the work that ENDA is doing there, working around estuaries, technology, and farming. And again, they emphasize the importance of looking at local experiences and how these can help with looking at sustainable interventions, whether they're around energy, farming, and those kinds of issues. And then lastly, we had the perspectives from the regional economic bodies as well as the development finance institutions. So the ECOWAS, they gave us some of their interventions, the environmental policy that they have, which has been approved by the heads of states, and their focus on promoting biodiversity and the emphasis on, of course, the forest. Then Vanessa, I think we came back a second time and really sharing with us the work that they're doing in terms of to transition to green growth, and some of the thinking of the African Development Bank around nature-based economies, nature-based financial solutions, and enhancing this through valuation of nature, and linking that to policies. So she also gave some examples of how they are working with different partners in terms of using nature-based solutions in some of the work around infrastructure development. And then lastly, we had Noor, who was looking at the Central African states, the bank that they have supporting some of the work there, with an emphasis on the Congo Basin region, and the principles that they've applied to ensure that the investments that they undertake do no harm to biodiversity, forests, and those kinds of issues. So I think those are sort of the highlights of what we heard. Is very rich, and it's difficult to do justice to really something that as diverse as this. But I think this was an important conversation that is needed for us to bring together the key stakeholders, local level, at the regional entities, development finance institutions, CSO perspectives, to share how important biodiversity is. And I think that bringing Sandy in was really powerful in terms of this global review that they've done on the economics of biodiversity. So over.
Okay, thank you very much, Yemi. Zeneb, I hope you're ready. We have definitely come to the end of the session. We are already 6 minutes late, and I hope the participants will be able to bear with us. So over to you, Zeneb, for this closing session.
Thank you, Pauline, and thank you to everybody. I have a poor connection today. It can be cut at any time. If that happens, I will send you the closing remarks by email. But dear colleagues from civil society organizations, economic regional institutions, IFIs, and colleagues from the bank, I wish to thank you again for taking part of this webinar. It's my pleasure to have been part of this productive conversation on the economic value of biodiversity organized by the Africa CSO Biodiversity Alliance in collaboration with the African Development Bank. And I'm very happy to note the involvement of civil society together with IFIs, REX, in this conversation. Civil society is a key stakeholder that promotes community-based solutions, and involving them in policy dialogue, in biodiversity is therefore very important for the bank, because that assures transparency, inclusion, ownership of our operations. Today, we have exchanged and shared experiences, and we learned a lot from different stakeholders here. But we also identify perspective coming from the ground. The presenters, the great presenters and the good moderation, they add value on explaining how well different institutions are working to promote conservation economy that delivers tangible benefit for Africa. Meetings like this help to find out how African economies can benefit from the continent's abundant natural resources and identify economic opportunities. I'm convinced that the conclusion of the report that we talk about will help to strengthen dialogue between civil society, regional economic bodies, and financial institutions. But the conversation must go on beyond this meeting, and the bank will play
particular attention to the conclusion of this dialogue that we'll implement together. To conclude, dear participants, I would like to encourage all of us to come together and mobilize towards the upcoming COP15 on biodiversity scheduled in October. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zeynep. Thank you very much, all the presenters and the panelists and the, even the participants. And I've been your moderator, Pauline Nantongo Kalunda, and I did so in my capacity as the chairperson of the policy working group of the Africa Civil Society Biodiversity Alliance. We worked very closely with the bank, especially the the gender department, the civil society department, the African Learning Center that Vanessa represented, and there's been very active participation from the Africa Development Bank and the ACBA Alliance. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is part of a webinar, of a series of webinars, and we will continue discussing during, before, and even after we finished putting together the post-2020 biodiversity framework. There is quite a rich and diverse contribution that is coming through. We are going to be putting together a report. We will be sharing the link of the recording with all the participants, and we will also put together a press release that we will share on our social network, social, whatever networks, the word has gone out of my head. But thank you very much for participating. This has been, we have now shall be communicating. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. And I hosted you
Bye-bye.
from sunny, beautiful Uganda.